My great-grandfather was in charge here from 1910 to 1922. He was known as Bobby. An incredible dandy, a fastidious dresser. He really loved his clothes. And you can see in this portrait his affection for his high collars. So dramatic and self-confident, bordering on the arrogant. He died exactly 100 years ago in September 1922, and he had an interesting but tragic life. So many of my ancestors married for different reasons, but he married Margaret Baring for love. He was mad about her. Tragically, she died giving birth to their 6th child, and he never got over this. When I found his diaries, they'd been sealed up in a bank vault. It's just so devastating to read. There wasn't an anniversary, whether of them meeting, of them getting engaged, getting married, that he didn't mark with huge sadness. It comes leaping out of the page. He was the youngest member of Parliament in the House of Commons when he entered there. He was also the right-hand man to King Edward VII, who was Queen Victoria's son. Was a very loyal servant to him, really, and confidant. And it's interesting reading his account of Edward VII's deathbed. He was massively overweight, and very unhealthy liver, and he rallies from this very serious illness. People say to Edward VII, "And what would you like?" And he said, "Well, I'd really like some very buttery scrambled eggs," which he eats and then dies. It's obviously the last thing his constitution needed. And I love these connections with history through the eyes of ancestors who saw it. He writes, "The loss of life from Titanic is appalling, certainly over 1,400 souls." There was this moment in 1913, the year before the First World War broke out across Europe, where there was a sort of feeling of end of empire, really. And so he had to bridge that. All of the men from the estate went off to fight, and after the war ended, at the end of 1918, a very different world emerged. How is he going to keep this going? It seems to be a house and an estate from a different age. It wouldn't have been socially acceptable for him to get a proper job. So he really struggled to keep the place going and briefly moved out, in fact. About 25 years ago, a woman came to visit the house. She was 106. She said it was the first time she'd been allowed through the front door of the house because people who worked here weren't allowed to access the house through the front door. And she remembered my great-grandfather. And I was so intrigued. I said, "What was my great-grandfather like?" And I was rather expecting her to lay on the flattery in his memory. And she went, "He was a very ordinary man." And I thought that was fantastic, really, because actually what she meant was that he was down to earth and normal, and not as snobbish and ridiculous as some of his portraits would seem to suggest. So his last entry, just a couple of weeks or so before his death, his final words are, "Lovely day," which I think is a rather nice way to bow out.